What happens when a seemingly innocent friendship turns into a deadly obsession? Could a neighbor's relationship really spiral out of control so quickly? Discover the dark truths behind the neighbor's affair that ended in murder. Daniel Hartley had always dreamt of escaping the frenetic pace of city life for the serene surroundings of a small town. When he found a charming house on the outskirts of Elmsford, he saw it as the perfect opportunity for a fresh start. Elmsford, with its charming tree-lined streets and historic homes, offered Daniel a peaceful escape from city life. The town's small businesses and friendly atmosphere made it an inviting place for a fresh start. The move to Elmsford had been both a relief and an adventure for Daniel. He spent his first few days in the new house unpacking, arranging furniture, and settling into what he hoped would be a peaceful new chapter of his life. Elmsford, with its quiet charm and friendly atmosphere, seemed like the perfect place to start afresh. One afternoon, after hours of organizing his garage, Daniel decided to take a break and explore the nearby park. The crisp autumn air and the colorful foliage provided a serene escape, a stark contrast to the chaos of moving. As he wandered through the park's winding paths, his eyes fell on a striking woman sitting on a bench, lost in thought. She had an air of elegance about her, with a beauty that was impossible to ignore. Intrigued, Daniel decided to approach her, hoping to strike up a conversation. However, as Daniel drew closer, the woman glanced up at him with a look of disinterest. Julia Thompson, who was enjoying her usual afternoon walk, was not in the mood for small talk, especially not with a stranger. Julia was a prominent figure in Elmsford, known for her involvement in various community activities and social events. In her early 30s, she carried herself with a certain grace and confidence, often admired by those around her. But today, her mind was elsewhere, preoccupied with personal matters that weighed heavily on her. When Daniel greeted her, hoping to break the ice, she barely acknowledged him. Instead, she stood up, gave him a dismissive look that bordered on disgust, and walked away without a word. Daniel was left standing there, surprised and slightly embarrassed by the abrupt rejection. A few days later, Daniel was back at home, busy in his garage, still adjusting to life in the new neighborhood. He was determined to settle in and make the most of his fresh start. As he worked, he noticed movement out of the corner of his eye. Looking up, he saw the same woman from the park, standing a few yards away, observing him intently. Julia had been outside, tending to her garden when she caught sight of her new neighbor. As she watched him work, a realization struck her. This was the same man she had brushed off at the park. A pang of guilt hit her as she recalled her cold reaction. Deciding to make amends, Julia walked over to Daniel, her earlier aloofness replaced with a tentative warmth. As she approached, Daniel recognized her instantly. Julia, now feeling a bit awkward, apologized for her behavior at the park. She explained that she hadn't realized he was her new neighbor, and admitted that she had been preoccupied that day. To make up for her earlier rudeness, Julia offered him a basket of homemade cookies, a gesture she often extended to new residents in the neighborhood. Daniel accepted the cookies with a smile, appreciating the effort she was making to smooth things over. The tension between them eased as they began to talk, sharing stories about their lives and discussing the quirks of the town. What had started as an awkward encounter began to blossom into a friendship, with both of them gradually letting their guards down. This simple act of kindness from Julia marked the beginning of their connection. Over time, their paths crossed more frequently, and what began as a friendly neighborly bond soon grew deeper. However, neither of them could foresee the complex emotions and hidden secrets that would soon surface, leading their relationship down a dark and unforeseen path. Over the following weeks, Daniel and Julia's initial acquaintance gradually blossomed into a deep and meaningful friendship. Julia's frequent visits to Daniel's home became a regular occurrence, each meeting drawing them closer together. They shared more than just casual conversation. They delved into the intimate details of their lives, dreams, and the challenges they had faced. Daniel, who had recently left behind the fast-paced life of the city, found in Julia someone who genuinely understood his need for change. He spoke candidly about his former life, a world filled with endless work commitments, shallow relationships, and a constant sense of emptiness, despite his success. Daniel had moved to Elmsford seeking peace and a more meaningful existence, hoping to rediscover what truly mattered in life. He shared how the city, with all its opportunities, had drained him, leaving him yearning for something simpler, more real. Julia, in turn, opened up about her life in Elmsford. She described the town's charm, the warmth of its residents, and how it had always been her sanctuary. Yet, beneath her composed exterior, Julia harbored her own struggles. Despite being admired by many for her involvement in community activities and her graceful demeanor, Julia often felt isolated. Her days were filled with routine, and though she was surrounded by people, she found herself grappling with a deep sense of loneliness. Julia confided in Daniel about the pressures she faced, the expectations placed upon her by the community, and the void that had grown in her life over time. As their friendship deepened, Daniel found solace in Julia's presence. Her warmth and understanding were a welcome change from the superficial interactions he had endured in the city. She had a way of making him feel seen and heard, something he hadn't experienced in a long time. For Julia, Daniel's fresh perspective and empathetic ear provided a much-needed escape from the solitude that often weighed on her. Their conversations were a blend of light-hearted banter and deep reflections, allowing them to connect on multiple levels. As time passed, their connection grew stronger, and they began to spend more time together outside of their usual meetups. One day, Daniel suggested they go swimming at a nearby pool. Julia hesitated at first. She wasn't very good at swimming, and the idea made her a bit nervous. However, she didn't want to disappoint Daniel, who seemed excited about the idea, so she agreed to go with him. When they arrived at the pool, Daniel immediately jumped in, beckoning Julia to join him. She hesitated at the edge, but Daniel's encouraging smile and promise to teach her how to swim better gave her the confidence to enter the water. As Daniel guided her through the basics, his hands gently supported her, helping her stay afloat and avoid any mishaps. The contact, though innocent, sparked a physical awareness between them that neither could ignore. As the lesson progressed, the atmosphere became more charged. Daniel's touches were meant to steady her, but they soon took on a different meaning as both became increasingly aware of the growing tension between them. At one point, while holding Julia to prevent her from slipping, their faces drew close, and before they knew it, they were kissing. The kiss was brief, almost as if it hadn't happened at all, and they quickly pulled away, both startled by the suddenness of the moment. Julia, flustered and unsure of how to react, decided it was time to head home. Daniel agreed, and they both left the pool in a silence filled with unspoken thoughts. When they reached Julia's house, she invited Daniel in, not wanting to end the evening so abruptly. They entered quietly, the tension from the pool still hanging in the air. As Daniel was about to say goodbye and leave, the silence between them became too much to bear. Just as he turned to go, Julia, unable to contain her emotions any longer, rushed towards him and pulled him into a deep, passionate kiss. The initial shock quickly melted away as they surrendered to the moment, their arms wrapping around each other in a desperate embrace. The kiss was intense, filled with all the pent-up emotions that had been building between them over the past weeks. From that point on, their relationship took a turn from friendship to something much deeper. Their bond, once based on companionship and shared experiences, evolved into a passionate affair. The connection they had always felt was now undeniable, and they found themselves drawn to each other in ways that neither had anticipated. Their love affair began that night, marking the start of a relationship that would bring both joy and turmoil into their lives. Their love affair seemed like a dream come true at first. Daniel and Julia's relationship blossomed quickly, with both of them enjoying each other's company in ways they hadn't anticipated. They became inseparable, spending time together at every opportunity. They went to the cinema, strolled along the beach, and attended public gatherings as if they were a couple. In the small community of Elmsford, their relationship quickly became the subject of gossip, with everyone whispering about the new lovebirds. But beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect relationship, a darker side began to emerge. Daniel, who had initially appeared charming and kind, started to show signs of his deeply rooted issues. He had a temper, one that he struggled to control, and his anger was often disproportionate to the situation at hand. Small disagreements quickly escalated into full-blown arguments, and Daniel's frustration would sometimes lead to physical violence. His obsession with Julia began to take a toll on their relationship, casting a shadow over what had once been a joyful connection. At first, Julia tried to ignore the signs, convincing herself that Daniel's behavior was just a result of stress or a temporary phase. She excused his outbursts, believing that his love for her was genuine and that he would change over time. But as the incidents became more frequent, Julia found it harder to justify his actions. Daniel's jealousy became suffocating. He grew increasingly possessive, suspicious of any interaction Julia had with other men. If he saw her talking to someone else, even if it was a harmless conversation, he would immediately assume the worst. This obsessive jealousy led to countless confrontations. Daniel would accuse Julia of being unfaithful, despite there being no evidence to support his claims. His paranoia clouded his judgment, and every interaction Julia had outside their relationship became a potential threat in his eyes. The accusations would often escalate into violence, with Daniel lashing out at Julia in a fit of rage. He would beat her, leaving bruises that she would try to hide from the prying eyes of the community. After each incident, he would storm out of her house, leaving her alone and shaken. But the cycle didn't end there. After his anger had subsided, Daniel would return, full of remorse and apologies. He would beg for Julia's forgiveness, promising that it would never happen again. And each time Julia, still holding on to the hope that things could go back to the way they were, would forgive him. She was trapped in a vicious cycle, torn between her love for Daniel and the fear of what he might do next. The more time passed, the more Daniel's behavior began to unravel. His obsession with Julia was consuming him, turning him into someone she barely recognized. The man who had once been her escape from loneliness had become the source of her greatest fears. Yet, despite the danger, Julia found it difficult to break free from the relationship. The connection they had shared, the memories of their early days together, and the hope that Daniel might change kept her bound to him. As the rumors about their relationship spread through Elmsford, Julia became increasingly isolated. She withdrew from her friends and the community, trying to keep up the facade that everything was fine. But the truth was far from it. The love that had once been a source of happiness had turned into a nightmare, one from which Julia couldn't wake up. Daniel's obsession, his inability to control his anger, and his deep-seated insecurities were tearing them apart. Julia knew that things couldn't continue like this, but she was too afraid to leave, not knowing what Daniel might do if she tried to end the relationship. She was trapped, caught in the web of a love that had gone horribly wrong, with no clear way out. On a warm afternoon, Daniel and Julia decided to spend the day at the park, a place that had become their refuge from the prying eyes of the small community. Under the gentle breeze and the sound of children playing in the distance, they found a quiet spot under one of the large oaks. Spreading out a blanket, they settled down with plans to relax, laugh, and savor the day. As they sat together, the tranquility of the moment was briefly interrupted when Julia realized they had forgotten to bring snacks. She decided to get some from the nearby vendor, excusing herself and leaving Daniel behind on the blanket. Daniel watched as she walked away, her figure gradually blending into the small crowd gathered near the snack stand. Julia's mind wandered as she approached the vendor, her thoughts a mix of the peaceful day and the undercurrents of tension that always seemed to accompany her relationship with Daniel. It was at this moment, amidst the quietude of the park, that she happened to cross paths with a familiar face from her past. It was Kelvin, a former classmate from her high school days. Kelvin, who had always been warm and approachable, had moved away shortly after graduation, and their lives had taken different paths. His sudden appearance brought back a flood of memories, and for a moment, she was caught up in the nostalgia of old friendships. Seeing him after all these years was unexpected, and Julia felt a mix of surprise and warmth as they exchanged pleasantries, catching up on the years that had passed. Unbeknownst to Julia, Daniel's gaze had been fixed on her from the moment she left his side. As he observed the interaction from a distance, a dark cloud of jealousy began to overshadow the peaceful day. The sight of Julia conversing with another man, smiling and engaged in what seemed to be an intimate conversation, triggered something deep within him. His insecurities, already simmering beneath the surface, flared up violently, transforming his initial curiosity into a boiling rage. Without giving himself a moment to consider or understand the situation, Daniel stood up abruptly, his expression darkening as he made his way toward them. His mind was clouded by a storm of irrational thoughts, each one feeding into his growing anger. As he approached, the distance between them closed rapidly, and with each step, his fury intensified. Reaching Julia and Kelvin, Daniel's anger erupted uncontrollably. Without waiting for an explanation, without even acknowledging Kelvin, he lashed out at Julia. The force of his anger was swift and brutal, catching Julia off guard and leaving Kelvin in shocked silence. Daniel's accusations, venomous and unfounded, poured out as he physically assaulted Julia in front of everyone in the park. The scene unfolded rapidly, with park-goers stopping in their tracks, horrified by the sudden and violent confrontation. Daniel's words were laced with accusations of betrayal, his paranoia convincing him that Julia had been unfaithful. The sight of her with another man, even an old friend, had ignited his deepest fears, and in his rage, he saw only the worst. Julia, stunned and reeling from the attack, could barely comprehend what was happening. The friendly conversation with Kelvin had been completely innocent, a simple exchange of memories between old acquaintances. But Daniel's mind, twisted by jealousy, could not see beyond his insecurities. He left the park abruptly, leaving behind a scene of confusion, pain, and humiliation. As Daniel stormed off, his emotions were in turmoil. He drove away in a rage. The peaceful day at the park had been shattered, replaced by a whirlwind of anger and mistrust that now threatened to unravel everything he and Julia had shared. Julia remained on the ground, her body trembling as she wept, consumed by a wave of regret and humiliation. The once serene park had transformed into a stage for her public disgrace, leaving her emotionally shattered. The people around her, who had been enjoying the peaceful atmosphere moments earlier, were now frozen in shock, unable to process the violent scene they had just witnessed. The sight of Julia being beaten by Daniel had jolted the community, and the incident quickly became the topic of conversation, spreading like wildfire through the town. As she lay there, trying to collect her thoughts, Julia was surrounded by a growing crowd of onlookers, all whispering among themselves, their expressions a mix of shock and pity. The incident was an unimaginable breach of the quiet life they had come to expect in their community, and the scandal was bound to be the subject of endless gossip. Kelvin, the old friend from high school whom Julia had innocently greeted, stood nearby, stunned and unsure of what to do. The events had unfolded so quickly that he was left speechless, struggling to make sense of Daniel's violent outburst. Kelvin had merely exchanged a few pleasantries with Julia, but Daniel's reaction had been explosive, fueled by jealousy and rage. Kelvin hesitated, then, realizing Julia needed help, he cautiously approached her. Without saying much, he gently helped her to her feet and guided her to a nearby bench. She was visibly shaken, her face streaked with tears, and her body still trembling from the assault. Kelvin's heart ached for her, but he knew there was little he could do at that moment. After ensuring she was seated and somewhat composed, he quietly excused himself and left the park, not wanting to intrude any further on her pain. Julia remained seated for a while, her mind racing as she tried to process what had just happened. The man she had once thought of as a refuge from her loneliness had now become the source of her deepest anguish. The relationship that had started with such passion and excitement had turned into something dark and destructive. The love that had once filled her life with joy had morphed into an obsession that left her bruised and broken, both physically and emotionally. The reality of her situation was undeniable. She could no longer continue this toxic relationship with Daniel. After what felt like hours, Julia finally found the strength to stand up and make her way home. Each step was heavy, not just from the physical pain, but from the weight of the emotional burden she carried. Her mind was made up. She knew she had to end things with Daniel, to put a stop to the violence and regain control of her life. As she walked home, the sun began to set, casting long shadows on the ground. The cool evening air did little to soothe the turmoil within her. Her decision to confront Daniel was firm, but that didn't make it any easier. She knew that ending the relationship was the only way to save herself, but the thought of facing Daniel one last time filled her with dread. When Julia arrived at her house, she took a moment to gather herself. The quiet of her home contrasted sharply with the chaos in her mind. She knew what she had to do. With renewed determination, she made her way to Daniel's apartment, The walk was short, but it felt like an eternity, each step bringing her closer to the confrontation she had been dreading. Without knocking, Julia opened the door to Daniel's apartment and stepped inside. The familiar scent of his cooking filled the air, a reminder of the times they had spent together. But those memories were tainted now, overshadowed by the violence and pain that had come to define their relationship. Daniel was in the kitchen, seemingly unaware of her arrival, engrossed in preparing a meal. The sight of him, so calm and focused, only reinforced Julia's resolve. She had to end this now, before it consumed her completely. There was no room for apologies or explanations. This was the end. Julia knew that walking away was the only option left. Her decision had been made, and she was determined to follow through, no matter how difficult it would be. As she left Daniel's apartment, the door closing behind her, a heavy silence settled in. Daniel, still in the kitchen, was left in stunned disbelief. The abruptness of it all had taken him by surprise. His world, once centered around his intense relationship with Julia, was now crumbling. The love affair that had been the focus of his life was over, ended in a moment of clarity and finality. Julia's departure marked the end of a chapter that had been filled with passion, but marred by obsession and violence. Daniel was left alone to face the reality of what he had lost, the echoes of her final departure lingering in the air. As the weeks went by, life seemed to return to normal for Julia. She went about her daily routine, relieved to be free from the toxic relationship that had once consumed her. The decision to end things with Daniel had been difficult, but it was the right choice. However, unbeknownst to her, Daniel's mind was unraveling. The thought of losing Julia had driven him to the brink of madness. His obsession with her, once masked as love, had now fully revealed itself as a dangerous fixation. He could not accept that Julia was no longer his, and the thought of her living a life without him gnawed at him relentlessly. One fateful day, unable to contain his spiraling thoughts any longer, Daniel made a decision that would shatter both of their lives. He walked into his kitchen, his eyes wild with a mix of anger, pain, and desperation. He reached for a knife, its cold metal handle firm in his grip, and without a second thought, he left his apartment and headed toward Julia's. His movements were mechanical, driven by a singular, dark purpose. As he made his way through the neighborhood, a few neighbors noticed the knife in his hand and the unsettling look on his face. Sensing that something was terribly wrong, they quickly called the police, hoping to intervene before it was too late. But time was not on Julia's side. Daniel, driven by his obsession, reached her apartment before the authorities could arrive. He burst through her door, his face contorted with a twisted mix of fury and anguish. Julia, caught off guard, looked up in horror as she saw the knife in his hand. She pleaded with him, her voice trembling as she begged for her life, but her words fell on deaf ears. Daniel was beyond reason. His mind had snapped, and all that remained was the overwhelming compulsion to make sure that if he couldn't have Julia, no one else could. Julia tried to escape, running through her apartment in a desperate attempt to flee from Daniel's madness. Her screams echoed through the walls, a haunting cry for help that would go unanswered. Daniel pursued her relentlessly, his eyes fixed on his target, his grip tightening on the knife. The chase was short but terrifying, with Julia desperately trying to find a way out. But there was no escape. Daniel, fueled by his obsession, finally caught up with her. In a frenzied rage, he stabbed her repeatedly, each blow driven by the twisted belief that this was the only way to keep her forever. As Julia's life ebbed away, Daniel stood over her lifeless body, panting and trembling with adrenaline. The reality of what he had just done began to sink in, but it was too late. The love that had once brought them together had now ended in unspeakable tragedy. The apartment, once a place of warmth and intimacy, was now a scene of horror. Blood stained the floors, and the air was thick with the scent of violence. Daniel's breaths came in ragged gasps as he stared down at Julia's lifeless form, the gravity of his actions starting to seep into his consciousness. At that moment, the sound of sirens pierced the air, growing louder as the police arrived. The door to the apartment was kicked open, and officers stormed in, their guns drawn. They found Daniel standing over Julia's body, the knife still in his hand. His eyes were vacant, his mind numb to the chaos around him. The police quickly subdued him, pulling him away from the grisly scene. As they handcuffed him and led him out of the apartment, Daniel offered no resistance. His once fiery obsession had burned out, leaving nothing but emptiness in its wake. The news of Julia's murder spread quickly through the community, sending shockwaves of grief and fear. The once peaceful neighborhood was now overshadowed by the brutal crime, and the residents struggled to come to terms with the loss of a life that had been so tragically cut short. Julia's death became the focal point of countless conversations, with everyone trying to understand how such a horrific event could have happened in their midst. Daniel's trial was swift and widely covered in the media. The details of the crime were laid bare for all to see, painting a chilling picture of a man whose obsession had driven him to commit an unspeakable act. The courtroom was packed with spectators, all eager to witness the outcome of the trial. Daniel sat in silence throughout, his expression devoid of emotion. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and the jury quickly reached a unanimous verdict of guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a fate that seemed almost merciful compared to the horrors he had inflicted on Julia. In the aftermath of the trial, the community was left to grapple with the lingering impact of Julia's murder. The park where the two had often been seen together became a somber reminder of the life that had been stolen. Neighbors spoke of Julia with a mix of sorrow and guilt, wondering if there had been any signs they had missed, any way they could have intervened before it was too late. The once vibrant social gatherings now felt subdued, overshadowed by the memory of the violence that had shattered their sense of safety. Daniel's arrest and subsequent imprisonment brought some measure of justice, but it could not erase the pain and loss that Julia's family and friends felt. Her death left a void that could never be filled, and the scars of that day would linger in the hearts of those who knew her. The story of Daniel and Julia became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of how love, when twisted by obsession, can lead to the darkest of places. Want to see more like this? Then click on the video you are seeing on your screen now.